"Excuse me, but this clause is a trap," the poor girl said, and the CEO's smile instantly faded. "Hello, my precious and deeply respected family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. I carry your love in my heart every single day. You are not just an audience. You are the reason my voice has meaning. You are the soul of this space, and I thank God for you. Sometimes I wonder, do you still feel what I feel? Not for the views, not for fame, but for the bond we created. If your heart still remembers, please type these words in the comments. I still believe in you. That one sentence, it's everything. It reminds me that I'm not alone in this love, that this family still holds me close, even in quiet moments. You matter, you are important, and even if life gets heavy, I'm praying for you, truly praying. Here's my heart's prayer. May peace cover you like soft morning light. May your days be full of kindness, your nights full of rest, and your future wrapped in grace. May you always be surrounded by people who see your worth. This is more than content. This is love. And I hope you always know I still believe in you. The fluorescent light in Claudia Mia's bathroom flickered as she applied mascara with steady hands. The cracked mirror reflected back a woman who looked professional. If you overlooked the safety pin holding her skirt's waistband together, or the worn spots on her shoes that no polish could hide. At 26, Claudia had mastered making the most of very little, a skill forged by necessity, not choice. "You've got this, girl," she whispered to her reflection, straightening the blazer. She'd bought from Goodwill 3 years ago. It still fit perfectly, though the fabric had grown thin in places from countless washings. The interview at Cumming Enterprises wasn't just an opportunity. It was her lifeline out of the cycle of poverty that had gripped her family for generations. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Good luck today, mija. Praying for you." Claudia's chest tightened. Mama's medical bills were piling up again, and her 15-year-old brother Marcus needed new textbooks for his advanced placement classes. The part-time paralegal job at Rodriguez and Associates Legal aid barely covered rent, let alone the mountain of expenses that seemed to grow daily. This contract work with Cumming Enterprises could change everything. The subway ride downtown took 45 minutes, giving Claudia time to review her notes. One final time, she'd researched everything she could about the company. How John Cumming had inherited the tech empire at 24 after his father's sudden death. How he'd tripled the company's value in 8 years. How he was considered one of the city's most eligible bachelors by the society pages she'd never be able to afford. When the glass towers of the financial district came into view, Claudia felt her confidence waver. She'd grown up in East Hartford, where the tallest building was the 3-story apartment complex where her grandmother still lived. This world of gleaming steel and endless wealth felt as foreign as another planet. The lobby of Cumming Enterprises took her breath away. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath soaring ceilings, and the reception desk looked like it cost more than her annual salary. Well-dressed people moved purposefully through the space, their designer shoes clicking against the polished stone. "Excuse me," Claudia approached the receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman who looked like she'd stepped from a magazine. "I'm Claudia Mia from Rodriguez and Associates. I have an appointment with Mr. Cumming about the contract review position." The receptionist's eyes swept over Claudia's outfit with barely concealed disdain. "Take the express elevator to the 40th floor. Someone will meet you there." The elevator ride felt eternal. Claudia caught glimpses of herself in the polished steel walls and fought the urge to run. What was she doing here? She belonged in the cramped offices of legal aid, helping people who couldn't afford lawyers, not in this temple to capitalism. The 40th floor was a study in understated luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the city, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. A slim woman in an expensive suit approached her. "Ms. Mia, I'm Jennifer Walsh, Mr. Cummings' assistant. He's ready for you. Now, Jennifer led her down a hallway lined with original artwork toward massive double doors. Just so you know, Mr. Cumming values directness and efficiency. He doesn't have much time for small talk. The warning sent a spike of anxiety through Claudia's chest, but she straightened her shoulders. She'd dealt with difficult clients before. How different could this be? The doors opened to reveal an office larger than Claudia's entire apartment. Behind an imposing desk sat John Cumming, and business magazine photographs hadn't captured his commanding presence. Dark hair, sharp jawline, and penetrating eyes that seemed to assess everything. Younger than she'd expected, yet he carried himself with the certainty of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. He didn't look up from his computer immediately, letting her stand there while he finished typing. It was clearly a power play, and Claudia felt her temper stir. She'd driven herself through law school, working 3 jobs, and graduated magna cum laude from a state school. She wouldn't be intimidated by someone who'd inherited his position. Ms. Meir. John finally glanced up, his expression neutral. Rodriguez and Associates wants to handle our smaller contract reviews. Tell me why I should trust a legal aid clinic with my company's business. The dismissive tone in his voice made Claudia's spine stiffen. She'd expected skepticism, but the barely concealed condescension was insulting. Because we catch things others miss, she said evenly. When you're used to fighting for every advantage, you learn to read the fine print very carefully. John leaned back in his leather chair, studying her intently. And you think that makes you qualified to handle corporate contracts worth millions? I think it makes me thorough, Claudia replied, pulling out a folder she'd prepared. I reviewed the sample contract your office sent. There's a liability clause in Section 12 that could expose you to significant risk if the vendor defaults on delivery timelines. For the first time, John looked genuinely interested. He pulled out his copy of the contract and flipped to the section she'd mentioned. His brow furrowed as he read. Explain, he said curtly. Claudia moved closer to his desk, pointing to the problematic language. The clause as written makes your company responsible for damages if the vendor fails to meet deadlines, regardless of the reason for delay. It's standard protective language for the vendor, but unusual to see it without reciprocal protections for the client. John was quiet for a long moment, reading the section again. When he looked up, something had shifted in his expression. The dismissive arrogance was still there, but now mixed with grudging respect. How long did it take you to spot that? About 15 minutes, Claudia admitted. But I've seen similar language used to exploit small businesses. My father lost his shop because of a clause just like this one. The personal revelation slipped out before she could stop it. John's eyebrows rose slightly, and Claudia cursed herself for oversharing. She didn't need his pity. Your father had a business? A small grocery store, Claudia said stiffly. He signed a supply contract without fully understanding the liability clauses. When the supplier's warehouse burned down, they held him responsible for the lost inventory and delivery delays. It bankrupted him. John was studying her with new intensity, and Claudia felt heat creep up her neck. She shouldn't have told him that. It made her sound bitter, damaged. But something in his expression wasn't pity. It was curiosity. That's unfortunate, he said finally. But business is business. Sometimes people get hurt. The casual callousness of his words hit Claudia like a slap. Sometimes people get hurt because others deliberately structure deals to protect themselves at the expense of the vulnerable. She shot back before she could stop herself. The air in the room grew tense. John's jaw tightened, and Claudia realized she'd just lectured one of the most powerful men in the city about business ethics. Her career was probably over before it started. But instead of ending the meeting, John leaned forward, his eyes never leaving her face. You think I structure my deals to hurt people, Ms. Meir? I think you structure them to protect your interests, Claudia replied carefully. Which is smart business. But it doesn't mean the consequences aren't real for the people on the other side. They stared at each other across the vast desk, and Claudia felt something electric in the air between them. It wasn't just professional tension. There was something deeper, more primal. John Cumming was devastatingly handsome, but more than that, he was intelligent and powerful in a way that both attracted and intimidated her. The contract is for 6 months initially, John said abruptly. Rodriguez and Associates will review all vendor agreements under $50,000. You'll report directly to my legal team, but I want weekly summaries of any issues you identify. Claudia blinked, stunned. Does that mean? It means you're hired, Miss Meir. John's lips curved in what might have been a smile. Don't make me regret it. As Claudia left his office, her heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with landing the contract. John Cumming was everything she should despise, privileged, arrogant, dismissive of people like her. But the way he'd looked at her, the spark of interest in his eyes when she'd challenged him, had awakened something she hadn't expected. This job was supposed to solve her financial problems. She hadn't counted on it creating entirely new complications. Of the heart. Chapter 2. Professional Tension. 3 weeks into her contract with Cumming Enterprises, Claudia had established a routine that both energized and challenged her. Every morning, she took the 6:30 a.m. subway from her working-class neighborhood to the gleaming financial district, carrying lunch in a brown bag while surrounded by commuters with expensive coffee and designer accessories. The gulf between worlds never stopped striking her. In elevator rides to the 32nd floor where the legal department operated, she stood quietly in her carefully maintained thrift store clothes, listening to conversations about Hampton's weekends and exclusive restaurant reservations. She didn't belong here yet, but she was determined to earn her place. "Monsieur," called David Chen, the head of legal, from his glass-walled office. "I've got another batch of vendor contracts for you to review. Marketing wants to expedite these, so I need your analysis by Thursday." Claudia hurried over, accepting the thick folder with genuine enthusiasm. In 3 weeks, she'd reviewed 47 contracts and caught 12 significant issues that could have cost the company thousands. The work was challenging in ways her legal aid cases never were. These contracts involved complex intellectual property clauses, international shipping terms, and liability structures that required careful analysis. "Also," David added, lowering his voice, "Cumming wants to sit in on today's review meeting. He's been asking about your work specifically." Claudia's pulse quickened involuntarily. She'd only seen John Cumming twice since her interview. Once, in the elevator, where he'd nodded politely but distantly, and once in the hallway where he'd walked past without acknowledging her at all. She told herself she was relieved by his lack of attention, but her body's reaction to hearing his name suggested otherwise. "Did he say why?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. David shrugged. "Cumming doesn't explain himself to anyone. Just make sure you're prepared." 2 hours later, Claudia sat in the 20th floor conference room, surrounded by the legal team as they waited for John to arrive. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the city sprawling endlessly. Below, a reminder of how high she'd climbed from her modest beginnings. "Before Mr. Cumming gets here," said David, "let's review Claudia's findings on the Morrison Technology contract." Claudia opened her folder, but before she could speak, the conference room door opened and John Cumming strode in. He wore a charcoal and grey suit that probably cost more than Claudia made in 6 months, and his presence seemed to fill the entire room. Her mouth went dry as their eyes met briefly before he took his seat at the head of the table. "Sorry I'm late," John said, though he didn't sound particularly apologetic. "I understand Ms. Meir has identified some concerns with our vendor agreements." David gestured to Claudia. Why don't you walk us through what you found? Claudia took a steadying breath and launched into her analysis. The Morrison contract contains termination clauses that heavily favor the vendor. If we need to end the relationship for non-performance, we're required to provide 90 days' notice and pay a substantial penalty. However, Morrison can terminate immediately for any reason with only 30 days' notice and no penalty. That's fairly standard, interrupted James Morrison, one of the senior attorneys. We needed their services, so we accepted their terms. Actually, Claudia said politely but firmly, I researched Morrison's other contracts through public filings. They've accepted more balanced termination clauses with 3 other companies in the past year. We likely could have negotiated better terms. The room fell silent. James looked uncomfortable, while David made notes on his tablet. But Claudia was hyper-aware of John's reaction. He was leaning forward slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. How much could this disparity potentially cost us? John asked. Claudia had anticipated this question. If we terminate early, the penalty clause could cost approximately $200,000. But more concerning is the imbalance of power. They can leave us scrambling for a replacement vendor with minimal notice while we're locked into lengthy procedures. To leave them? Interesting, John murmured. What would you recommend for future contracts with similar vendors? Reciprocal termination clauses with matching notice periods, Claudia replied immediately. And penalty structures that apply equally to both parties, or graduated penalties based on the length of the relationship. John nodded slowly, and Claudia felt a flush of pride at his apparent approval. But then James spoke up. With respect, Miss Meir, you're looking at this from a legal aid perspective, where you fight for every advantage. In corporate law, sometimes, you accept less favorable terms to secure valuable partnerships. The condescension in his tone made Claudia's jaw clench. I understand that, she said carefully, but accepting unfavorable terms should be a strategic choice, not an oversight. If we know we're giving up protections, we can negotiate for other concessions, better pricing, expanded services, or priority support. She's right, John said quietly, and the room's dynamic shifted instantly. We shouldn't be accepting disadvantageous terms without getting something in return. James flushed but nodded. David looked pleased, and Claudia felt John's approval like a warm glow in her chest, which both thrilled and alarmed her. The meeting continued for another hour, with Claudia presenting findings on 2 more contracts. Each time, John asked probing questions that demonstrated he was not only listening but analyzing her recommendations carefully. She found herself increasingly aware of his presence, the way he drummed his fingers on the table when thinking, how his voice deepened when he was concentrating, the way his eyes seemed to see everything. When the meeting ended, John lingered as the others filed out. Ms. Meir, could I speak with you for a moment? Claudia's heart hammered as the conference room emptied, leaving them alone. John moved to the windows, gazing out at the city below, and she couldn't help noticing how the afternoon light emphasized the sharp angles of his profile. You've been doing excellent work, he said without turning around. David tells me you've caught several issues our regular team missed. Thank you, Claudia replied, unsure where this was heading. John turned to face her, and she was struck again by how devastatingly handsome he was. But there was something else in his expression, curiosity mixed with what might have been conflict. I'm curious about something, he said. You clearly have exceptional analytical skills. Why legal aid? Why not corporate law where you could make significantly more money? The question hit a nerve. Because not everyone can afford corporate lawyers, Claudia said stiffly. Someone needs to help people who can't pay $300 an hour for legal advice. That's admirable, John said, and she couldn't tell if he was being sincere or patronizing. But you're supporting your family, aren't you? Wouldn't a corporate salary help them more than your idealism? Claudia felt heat rise in her cheeks. My idealism, as you call it, comes from watching my father lose everything because he couldn't afford proper legal review of his contracts. Sometimes principles and practicality align. John studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. Fair enough, he said finally. I'd like you to start reviewing larger contracts. Some of our international vendor agreements. The compensation will reflect the increased responsibility. Claudia blinked in surprise. Thank you. But I should mention that Rodriguez and Associates will need to approve any expansion of my role. Here, already handled, John said with a slight smile. I spoke with your boss this morning. He was quite complimentary about your work. As John moved toward the door, he paused beside her chair. For a moment, they were close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtly masculine that made her pulse quicken. One more thing, Ms. Mia, he said quietly. In the future, don't let people like James dismiss your perspective because of your background. Your experience gives you insights that our corporate lawyers lack. That's valuable. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Claudia alone in the conference room with her racing heart and the lingering scent of his cologne. That evening, as she rode the subway home to her cramped apartment, Claudia tried to analyze her reaction to John. Coming. He was arrogant and privileged, representing everything she'd learned to distrust about the wealthy elite. But he was also intelligent, perceptive, and, she was forced to admit, increasingly attractive to her in ways that had nothing to do with his money. The way he defended her perspective to James, the genuine interest in her recommendations, the almost compliment about her background being valuable, it all suggested depths she hadn't expected. But she couldn't afford to read too much into professional courtesy. They were from different worlds, and she was here to do a job, not develop feelings for her client. Still, as she climbed the stairs to her third-floor walk-up, Claudia couldn't shake the memory of how John had looked at her in that conference room, or the way her name sounded when he said it in that deep, measured voice. This job was becoming more complicated than she'd anticipated. Chapter 3. Excuse me, but this clause is a trap. 3 months into her contract with Cumming Enterprises, Claudia had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost comfortable. Almost. The work was challenging and engaging, her analyses were increasingly respected by the legal team, and the additional compensation had allowed her to catch up on her mother's medical bills for the first time in years. But there was one persistent complication that kept her off balance. John Cumming himself. He'd started attending more meetings where her work was discussed, always asking incisive questions that demonstrated he was paying close attention to her. Recommendations. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, intense and thoughtful, but guarded. Their brief interactions were always professional, but charged with an undercurrent of tension that made her acutely aware of his presence whenever he was in the room. Tonight, the 32nd floor was nearly empty as Claudia worked late, reviewing what David had described as the big one, a major acquisition contract that would allow Cumming Enterprises to absorb Hartwell Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that produced components for their tech products. The deal was worth $50 million, and John had specifically requested that she review the terms before final signatures. The contract was dense and complex, filled with technical language about asset transfers, employee obligations, and liability structures. But as Claudia worked through it section by section, a familiar chill of recognition began to settle in her stomach. She'd seen language like this before, not in corporate deals, but in the predatory contract that had destroyed her father's grocery store 15 years ago. The acquisition was structured to give Cumming Enterprises complete control over Hartwell's operations, while transferring most of the financial risk to the smaller company. If any aspect of the transition failed, supply chain disruptions, employee turnover, equipment failures, Hartwell would bear the costs even after being absorbed. It was legal, technically sound, and absolutely devastating to the people whose livelihoods depended on Hartwell. Claudia's hands trembled as she cross-referenced the liability clauses with industry standards. This wasn't a merger, it was a methodical dismantling, disguised as a business partnership. Once John's company took control, they could strip Hartwell's assets, eliminate redundant positions, and walk away clean if anything went wrong, leaving former Hartwell employees and vendors to absorb the losses. The worst part was how clever it was. Every clause had plausible justification. Every term could be defended as standard practice. Someone with John's intelligence would have understood exactly what these terms meant. This wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. By 10 p.m., Claudia had filled 12 pages with notes documenting how the contract would affect Hartwell's 300 employees, their families, and the network of small suppliers who depended on their business. The human cost was staggering, but she doubted anyone else had bothered to calculate it. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she was too agitated to notice. She kept thinking about her father. How proud he'd been of his little grocery store, how he'd trusted the supplier who'd promised him better prices and more reliable delivery. The contract that ruined him had contained similar language, reasonable sounding, terms that shifted all the risk to the smaller party. "Still here, Ms. Meir?" Claudia looked up to find John standing in the doorway of the small office she'd been assigned. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking less formal but somehow more dangerous. In the empty building, with only the security lights illuminating the hallway behind him, his presence felt more intimate than their usual professional encounters. "I wanted to finish reviewing the Hartwell contract," she said, hearing the strain in her own voice. John stepped into the office, and she was suddenly aware of how small the space was, how his tall frame seemed to fill it completely. "Find anything interesting?" The casual tone of his question made something snap inside her. He knew exactly what was in that contract. He knew what it would do to those people, and he was standing there acting like it was just another business deal. "Interesting?" Claudia stood abruptly, her chair rolling back against the wall. "You could call it that." John raised an eyebrow at her tone, but his expression remained neutral. "I take it you have concerns?" "Concerns." Claudia's voice rose despite her efforts to stay professional. She grabbed her analysis and strode around the desk, stopping directly in front of him. "Excuse me, but this clause is a trap." John's confident smile, the one that had been playing at the corners of his mouth, instantly faded. His blue eyes sharpened, focusing on her with sudden intensity. "Explain," he said quietly. "This entire contract is designed to destroy Hartwell while protecting you from any consequences," Claudia said, her professional composure cracking. "You're not acquiring them. You're dismantling them piece by piece and making them pay for the privilege." "That's quite an accusation," John said, his voice cooling. "Perhaps you should be more specific." Claudia opened her folder with shaking hands. Section 12 makes Hartwell responsible for all transition costs, including employee severance, if you decide their positions are redundant. Section 18 transfers liability for any supply chain disruptions to them, even though you'll be controlling operations. Section 24... "I'm familiar with the terms," John interrupted. "What's your point?" "My point is that this contract is exactly like the one that bankrupted my father." The words exploded out of her before she could stop them. The same predatory structure, the same impossible terms disguised as standard business practice. "You're going to destroy 300 families, and you're making it their fault." John was silent for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it. "Your father's situation is regrettable, but business decisions can't be based on sentiment. Hartwell is failing. We're offering them a way to preserve some value. By crushing them, Claudia shot back. You're not saving anything. You're picking the bones clean and leaving the rest to rot. And what would you suggest? Let them fail completely? At least this way, some jobs are preserved. Some jobs? Claudia laughed bitterly. According to your own projections, you'll eliminate 2/3 of their workforce within 6 months. The survivors will be working for wages you couldn't legally pay anyone else because they'll technically still be Hartwell employees until you decide to formally terminate their contracts. John's jaw tightened. You're being naive, Ms. Meir. This is how business works. Companies that can't compete get absorbed by stronger ones. It's natural selection. Natural selection? Claudia stared at him in disbelief. These are people, not animals. Maria Gonzalez has worked in Hartwell's accounting department for 15 years. She's got 3 kids and a mother with dementia. Natural selection to you is her choosing between rent and groceries when you eliminate her position. How do you know about specific employees? John asked sharply. Because I did my research, Claudia replied. I looked at their employee records, their supplier networks, their community connections. I calculated what this deal actually means. For real people, not just profit margins. You had no authorization to access that information. It's all public record. Annual reports, business filings, local newspaper articles about their community involvement. Information that apparently no one else bothered to review because it doesn't affect the bottom line. They were standing very close now, and Claudia could see golden flecks in John's blue eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. The anger and passion in her voice seemed to have awakened something in him. His breathing had quickened, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her pulse race, even as fury coursed through her veins. You think I don't know about the human cost? John asked quietly, his voice rough. You think I don't understand what these decisions mean? I think you know, and you don't care, Claudia said, refusing to back down despite their proximity. I think you've convinced yourself that making money justifies anything, even if it destroys innocent people. And I think you're an idealistic child who doesn't understand how the world actually works, John shot back, his controlled facade finally cracking. Do you have any idea what it takes to build and maintain a company this size? The responsibility for thousands of employees, millions of dollars in investor money, contracts and obligations that affect the entire economy. I understand that. With great power comes the choice of how to use it, Claudia replied fiercely. You could structure this deal to protect Hartwell's people. You could offer real job guarantees, fair severance packages, retraining programs, but that would cost money. And apparently your shareholders matter more than the people whose lives you're destroying. My shareholders include pension funds and retirement accounts for millions of ordinary people, John said, stepping closer. The teachers and firefighters and nurses whose futures depend on returns from investments like this. Should I sacrifice their security for your sense of moral purity? I'm not asking for moral purity, Claudia said, standing her ground even, though his nearness was making her heart pound. I'm asking for basic human decency. There's a difference between being profitable and being predatory. And you think you can tell the difference? You, who's never had to make a decision that affects more than a handful of people? I know the difference between right and wrong, Claudia said, her voice dropping to match his. And this contract is wrong. They stared at each other in charged silence, both breathing hard from their argument. Claudia was acutely aware of everything about him, how his tie had loosened during their confrontation, the faint scent of his cologne, the rapid rise and fall of his chest. The anger between them was electric, but underneath ran something else, something that made her skin feel hypersensitive and her thoughts scatter. What would you have me do? John asked finally, his voice barely audible. Find another way, Claudia replied, matching his quiet intensity. You're brilliant enough to structure a deal that works for everyone. The question is whether you care enough to try. For a moment, something flickered in John's eyes, uncertainty, maybe even regret, but then his expression hardened again. "The contract stands as written," he said coldly, stepping back. "File your report with whatever concerns you have, but don't expect them to change anything. This is business, Ms. Mia, not charity." He turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "And in the future, I suggest you focus on legal analysis rather than social work. It's what you're being paid for." After he left, Claudia sank into her chair, shaking from the confrontation. She'd just destroyed any chance of a professional relationship with one of the most powerful men in the city, possibly ruined her contract, and definitely complicated her life in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. But as she looked at the contract, still spread across her desk, she knew she'd done the right thing, even if it cost her everything. Chapter 4. Crossing Professional Lines. 3 weeks passed without a single word from John Cumming. Claudia had submitted her analysis of the Hartwell contract, documenting every problematic clause and suggesting alternative structures that would protect the smaller company's employees. David Chen had received her report with a non-committal nod and promised to pass along her concerns to the appropriate parties. The contract had been signed 2 days later without a single modification. She'd expected to be fired immediately. When that didn't happen, she'd braced herself for her contract to be terminated at the end of the month. But Rodriguez and Associates continued receiving payments, and David kept assigning her new vendor agreements to review. It was as if her confrontation with John had never happened, except for the complete absence of the man himself from any meeting she attended. Claudia told herself she was relieved. The last thing she needed was to deal with an arrogant CEO who saw human beings as expendable assets. But she couldn't stop thinking about that moment in her office, when their argument had reached its peak, the way John's eyes had blazed with something that looked like genuine conflict, the electricity that had crackled between them in the charged silence. She was being ridiculous. John Cumming was everything she despised about corporate America: privileged, ruthless, and willing to destroy lives for profit. The fact that he was devastatingly handsome and occasionally showed flashes of something deeper didn't change the fundamental incompatibility of their values. On a grey December afternoon, as Claudia reviewed a software licensing agreement in her small office, David appeared in her doorway looking uncomfortable. "Claudia, Mr. Cumming wants to see you in his office." Her stomach clenched. This was it, the delayed termination she'd been expecting. She gathered her papers with as much dignity as she could manage and followed David to the elevator. John's assistant waved her through to his office without looking up, and Claudia found herself once again in the imposing space with its floor-to-ceiling windows and museum-quality furniture. John was standing at his desk, reading through a thick folder, and didn't acknowledge her arrival for several long moments. "Sit down, Ms. Mia," he said finally, not looking up. Claudia took the chair across from his desk, studying his profile. As he continued reading, he looked tired, she realized. There were shadows under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. When he finally set the folder aside and met her gaze, his expression was carefully neutral. "I've been reviewing your work over the past 3 months, he said, without preamble. "Your analyses are thorough, and your recommendations have saved us considerable money." "Thank you," Claudia replied cautiously, unsure where this was leading. "I've also been thinking about our conversation regarding the Hartwell acquisition," John continued. "You raised some interesting points." Claudia waited, not trusting herself to speak. John leaned back in his chair, studying her with that intense blue gaze. "I want you to review 3 more acquisition contracts we're considering. But this time, I want you to do more than identify legal risks, I want you to propose alternative structures that address your humanitarian concerns while still protecting our interests." Claudia blinked in surprise. "I'm not sure I understand." "You criticized the Hartwell deal for being predatory," John said. "I'm giving you the opportunity to prove that ethical business practices can still be profitable. Show me how to structure these acquisitions without destroying the target companies." "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. John was quiet for a long moment. "Because maybe you were right about some things," he said finally. "And maybe I want to see if there's a better way to do business." Claudia felt her heart rate increase. "And if I can't, if protecting people makes the deals unprofitable, then we'll find out together," John replied. "But I suspect you're more creative than you've had the chance to demonstrate." Over the following weeks, Claudia threw herself into the project with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The three target companies, a small manufacturing firm, a software startup, and a family-owned logistics business, represented different challenges, but all shared the vulnerability that came with limited resources and experienced legal representation. She worked late most nights, researching precedents for ethical acquisition structures, consulting with her former professors, and modeling financial scenarios that would protect workers while still generating returns for coming enterprises. It was the most intellectually challenging work she'd ever undertaken, and also the most personally meaningful. John had taken to stopping by her office during her late-night sessions, initially to check on her progress, but increasingly just to talk. Their conversations started as debates about specific contract clauses, but gradually expanded to broader discussions about business ethics, social responsibility, and the role of corporations in society. You realize most CEOs would consider these protections unnecessarily generous, John said one evening, reviewing her proposed employee retention guarantees for the manufacturing company. "Most CEOs aren't trying to prove that ethical business can be profitable," Claudia replied, not looking up from her calculations. "Is that what I'm trying to prove?" Claudia glanced at him, struck by something vulnerable in his tone. "Isn't it?" John was quiet for a moment, loosening his tie as he considered her question. It was past 9 o'clock, and the building was nearly empty again. These late-night conversations had become a routine that Claudia both anticipated and dreaded, the charged atmosphere between them growing more intense with each encounter. "I inherited this company when I was 24, John said finally. "My father built it from nothing, and he believed that business was war. You either conquered or were conquered. I've been trying to live up to his legacy for 8 years. And now?" Claudia asked softly. "Now I'm wondering if legacy is worth the cost," he admitted. "The Hartwell deal will be completed next month. 300 people will lose their jobs just like you predicted." Claudia felt a pang of sympathy despite herself. "You could still restructure the terms, offer better severance packages, retraining programs." "I could," John agreed. "But my board would revolt. They hired me to maximize profits, not to manage a charity. Then maybe it's time to show them that doing the right thing doesn't have to hurt the bottom line," Claudia suggested. John smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since their argument. "Is that what these contracts are? Proof of concept?" "Maybe," Claudia said, feeling heat creep up her neck under his intense gaze. "Or maybe they're proof that you're not as ruthless as you pretend to be." "Careful, Miss Meir," John said quietly. "You might discover I'm more ruthless than you imagine." The warning should have chilled her, but instead it sent a shiver of awareness through her body. The air between them had grown thick with tension, and she was acutely conscious of how alone they were in the empty building. 2 weeks before Christmas, Claudia's apartment building lost heat during a particularly brutal cold. Snap! She'd spent 3 miserable nights wrapped in every blanket she owned, trying to work on the acquisition contracts while her breath formed clouds in the frigid air. When John noticed her shivering during a late meeting, she'd tried to brush off his questions about her apartment's conditions. "It's temporary," she'd insisted. "The landlord says it'll be fixed by the weekend." But when the weekend came and went with no heat restoration, John appeared at her office Monday morning with an expression that brooked no argument. "You're staying in my guest room until your heat is restored," he announced. "Absolutely not," Claudia replied immediately. "That would be completely inappropriate. What's inappropriate is you getting pneumonia because you're too stubborn to accept help," John shot back. "It's a practical solution to a temporary problem. It's a wealthy man offering charity to the poor girl," Claudia said sharply. "I don't need your pity." John's jaw tightened. "It's not pity, it's concern for a valued colleague who's working herself to death on my projects. If you collapse from exhaustion or illness, it affects my business." How flattering to be valued. "As a business asset," Claudia said sarcastically. "Damn it, Claudia," John exploded, using her first name for the first time. "I'm not offering this because you're poor. I'm offering because you're important. To the work, to the company, to—" He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he'd said too much. The sudden use of her first name and the intensity in his voice made her pulse race. "To what?" she asked quietly. John looked away, his jaw working as if he were fighting some internal battle. "To the success of these projects," he said finally, but the words sounded hollow. That evening, Claudia found herself in the elevator to John's penthouse, carrying a small overnight bag and feeling like she was making a terrible mistake. His apartment was exactly what she'd expected. Minimalist luxury with stunning views of the city, but somehow cold despite its obvious expense. "The guest room is down the hall," John said, maintaining careful distance as he showed her around. "Kitchen is fully stocked. Help yourself to anything. I'm usually not here much. I work late most nights." "John," Claudia said, stopping him, as he headed toward what she assumed was his home office. "Thank you. I know this is complicated." He turned to look at her, and for a moment the careful politeness dropped from his expression. "Everything about this is complicated, Claudia," he said quietly. For the first 3 nights, they barely saw each other. John left early and returned late, and Claudia spent her time working on the acquisition contracts or video calling her mother and brother from the guest room. But on Thursday night, she emerged from her room to find John in the kitchen, cooking what appeared to be an elaborate dinner. "I thought you survived on takeout and business lunches," she said, surprised. John glanced up from the stove, where he was stirring something that smelled incredible. "Cooking relaxes me," he admitted. "My father insisted I learn," said a man, "and should be able to take care of himself." "It smells amazing," Claudia said, realizing she'd been living on peanut butter sandwiches and whatever was available in the office break room. "Have you eaten dinner?" John asked. "I had a snack earlier," Claudia said evasively. John turned off the burner and faced her fully. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" "I eat plenty," she protested. "That's not what I asked." They stared at each other across the kitchen island, and Claudia felt that familiar tension crackling between them. But this time it was softer, more intimate, domestic in a way that felt dangerous. "Sit down," John said gently. "Let me feed you properly." Dinner was a revelation. John had prepared salmon with roasted vegetables and wild rice, paired with a wine that probably cost more than Claudia's monthly rent. But more surprising than the food was the conversation, easier and more personal than their office discussions, ranging from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. "What would you do if money weren't an issue?" John asked as they lingered. "Over wine, start a legal clinic that specializes in small business protection," Claudia answered without hesitation. "Help people like my father avoid predatory contracts. And personally, what would you want for yourself?" Claudia considered the question, acutely aware of John's intense focus on her answer. "A home," she said finally. "Not just a place to sleep, but a real home, family, security, the ability to help people without worrying about paying rent. That's all. That's everything, Claudia said softly. When she returned to the guest room that night, Claudia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the shift in their relationship. The man who'd cooked for her, who'd listened to her dreams with genuine interest, seemed completely different from the ruthless CEO she'd confronted months earlier. But she couldn't let herself forget the fundamental differences between them, or the impossibility of bridging the gap between their worlds. Her heat was restored the following Tuesday, but John convinced her to stay just one more night to make sure it was working properly. That night turned into another dinner, another evening of increasingly personal conversation, another night of lying awake thinking about the growing connection between them. It was nearly midnight when Claudia finally gave up on sleep and padded to the kitchen for a glass of water. She found John standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, still dressed in his work clothes, but with his tie long since discarded and his shirt partially unbuttoned. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. John turned, and in the dim light from the city below, his face looked younger, more vulnerable. "I keep thinking about the contracts you've been working on," he said, "about whether I have the courage to present them to my board." "You do," Claudia said with more certainty than she felt. "You wouldn't have asked me to create them if you didn't want to try. What if they reject them? What if they decide I'm not fit to run this company? Then you'll know you tried to do the right thing," Claudia replied, moving closer to the window. "That has to count for something." They stood side by side, looking out at the glittering city spread below them. Claudia was acutely aware of John's proximity, of the heat radiating from his body and the subtle scent of his cologne. "Claudia," John said quietly, and something in his voice made her turn to face him. "Yes? I need you to know that whatever happens with the board, whatever they decide about these contracts, this isn't about business anymore." "What is it about?" she whispered. Instead of answering, John reached up to cup her face gently, his thumb tracing along her cheekbone. "It's about this," he said softly, and leaned down to kiss her. The kiss was tender at first, tentative and questioning, but when Claudia responded, threading her fingers through his hair and pressing closer, John's control seemed to shatter. He backed her against the window, his mouth moving hungrily against hers, as months of tension and suppressed attraction finally found release. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. John rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "This is complicated," he said roughly. "Completely," Claudia agreed, but she didn't step away. "We work together. The board already questions my judgment. If they found out about this—" "I know," Claudia said softly. "We're from different worlds. This could destroy both our careers." John opened his eyes, studying her face in the dim light. "Are you going to let that stop you?" Claudia looked into his beautiful, conflicted eyes and realized she'd already made her choice. "No," she whispered. "Are you?" Instead of answering, John kissed her again, and this time neither of them held back. Chapter 5. Dangerous territory. The change in their relationship was impossible to hide. Where once Claudia and John had maintained careful, professional distance, now their interactions crackled with barely suppressed intimacy. During meetings, their eyes would meet across the conference table and hold just a moment too long. When John handed her documents, his fingers would brush hers with deliberate intent. When Claudia presented her analysis, she found herself unconsciously angling her body toward him, drawn by the magnetic pull that seemed to exist between them. It had been 3 weeks since their first kiss in his penthouse, 3 weeks of stolen moments and carefully maintained facades. They hadn't been alone together since that night. John had thrown himself into preparing for the board presentation of her acquisition contracts, while Claudia had moved back to her apartment and tried to pretend her world hadn't been completely upended by the taste of his mouth and the feel of his hands in her hair. But pretending was becoming impossible when every professional interaction felt charged with sexual tension. Ms. Mears' restructuring proposals are certainly creative, said board member Harrison Webb during the Wednesday morning presentation. His tone suggested creativity was not a virtue, but they significantly reduce our profit margins on all 3 acquisitions. Claudia sat at the end of the conference table, technically present as a legal consultant, but feeling very much like she was on trial. The 12 board members, 11 men in expensive suits, and 1 woman who looked like she could buy and sell small countries, had listened to John's presentation with varying degrees of skepticism. "The profit reduction is minimal," John replied smoothly, "and the risk mitigation more than compensates for the lost revenue. These structures protect us from costly litigation and public relations disasters." "Since when do we make business decisions based on public relations?" asked Victoria Blackston, the woman on the board whose family had been major shareholders since John's father founded the company. "Since social media can destroy a company's reputation overnight," John answered. "Consumer loyalty increasingly depends on perceived corporate ethics." Board member Richard Hartman, no relation to the company they'd recently acquired, leaned forward with a predatory smile. "And is this sudden interest in ethics related to your consultation with Ms. Mears? I understand she has quite strong opinions about corporate responsibility." The implication in his voice made Claudia's stomach clench, but John's expression remained perfectly controlled. "Ms. Mears' recommendations are based on sound legal analysis and industry best practices," he said coolly. "Her personal background helps her identify risks that our corporate attorneys might miss. I'm sure her background is quite illuminating," Hartman said with barely concealed condescension. Claudia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to remain silent. Defending herself would only make things worse, and John had specifically asked her to let him handle any board challenges. The presentation continued for another hour, with John fielding increasingly hostile questions about the financial impact of ethical business practices. When it finally ended, the board retired for private deliberation while Claudia and John were dismissed. "That went well," Claudia said sarcastically as they waited for the elevator. "They'll come around," John replied, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "They just need time to understand the long-term benefits." "Did you see Hartman's face when he was talking about my background?" Claudia asked. "He thinks I'm some kind of radical who's corrupted your judgment." John stopped walking and turned to face her, his blue eyes blazing. "Let me be very clear about something, Claudia. You haven't corrupted anything. You've opened my eyes to possibilities I was too arrogant to see before." The intensity in his voice made her pulse quicken, but they were standing in the middle of the office where anyone could see them. "John, I know we can't talk about this here," he said quietly, "but we need to discuss what happens next. Will you have dinner with me tonight, somewhere we can speak freely?" Claudia nodded, not trusting her voice. The way he was looking at her made it hard to think about anything beyond the memory of his mouth on hers. That evening, John picked her up in his Mercedes, a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than Claudia would make in 5 years. She'd changed into her one nice dress, a simple black cocktail dress she'd bought for her law school graduation, and was hyper-aware of how shabby she must look next to his obvious wealth. "You look beautiful," John said, as she settled into the leather passenger seat, and the genuine warmth in his voice made her feel like maybe the dress didn't matter. He took her to a small Italian restaurant in an upscale neighborhood she'd never visited, the kind of place where reservations were required weeks in advance, and the servers could probably identify her thrift store accessories from across the room. But the host greeted John by name and led them to a private corner table where they could talk without being overheard. How do you think the board will vote? Claudia asked after they'd ordered wine. Honestly, I think it's going to be close, John admitted. Harrison and Victoria will vote against anything that reduces profits. Hartman clearly thinks I've lost my objectivity, but some of the others seemed genuinely interested in the risk mitigation aspects. And if they vote no? John was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. Then I'll have to decide how hard I'm willing to fight for these changes. What does that mean? It means I might have to choose between keeping my position and doing what I think is right, he said simply. Claudia stared at him in shock. You'd risk your entire company over these contracts? I'd risk my position as CEO, John corrected. The company would survive. The board could replace me with someone more traditional. John, no, Claudia said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. You can't sacrifice everything because of my idealistic notions. These people depend on you for their jobs. These people depend on me to make the right decisions, John interrupted. And for the first time in 8 years, I think I know what the right decision looks like. The waiter arrived with their appetizers, forcing them to pause the conversation. But Claudia couldn't stop thinking about what John had said. The idea that he might lose everything because of her recommendations made her feel sick with guilt. I'm sorry, she said when they were alone again. I never meant for this to put you in an impossible position. You didn't put me anywhere, John said firmly. I asked for your help because I wanted to find a better way to do business. Whatever consequences come from that are my responsibility, not yours. They ate in relative silence for a while, both lost in thought. But as the evening progressed and the wine relaxed them, their conversation shifted from business to more personal topics. John told her about the pressure he'd felt taking over the company so young, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Claudia shared stories about her childhood, about watching her mother work. 3 jobs to keep them afloat after her father's business failed. Sometimes I feel like I'm living 2 different lives, Claudia admitted as they lingered over dessert. At the office, I'm this confident professional who belongs in boardrooms. But then I go home to my crumbling apartment and remember who I really am. And who do you think you really are? John asked softly. A girl from East Hartford who got lucky, Claudia said with a self-deprecating laugh. Someone who's pretending to belong in your world. John reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. You're not pretending anything. You're brilliant, passionate, and you see things others miss. You belong anywhere you choose to be. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. Even in a world where people like Hartman question whether someone like me should be advising someone like you, especially in that world, John said fiercely, because that world needs to change, and people like you are the ones who can change it. The drive back to her apartment was charged with tension. They'd carefully avoided discussing their relationship during dinner, but now the awareness crackled between them like electricity. When John walked her to her door, Claudia found herself reluctant to say goodbye. Thank you for dinner, she said, fishing for her keys with suddenly clumsy fingers. Claudia, John said quietly, and something in his voice made her look up at him. Yes, I need you to know that whatever the board decides tomorrow, this, he gestured between them, isn't going to change. I meant what I said that night in my apartment. This isn't about business anymore. Before she could respond, John cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a hunger that made her knees weak. She melted against him, her keys falling forgotten, to the ground as she wound her arms around his neck and lost herself in the taste and feel of him. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. John rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. I should go, he said roughly. Should, Claudia agreed, but neither of them moved. If I stay, everything changes, John warned. We won't be able to pretend this is just professional anymore. Maybe. I'm tired of pretending, Claudia whispered. John's eyes opened, searching her face in the dim hallway light. Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. Instead of answering, Claudia picked up her keys and unlocked her apartment door. Come in, she said softly. John hesitated for just a moment, then followed her inside. Claudia's apartment was tiny and shabby compared to his penthouse, a cramped studio with second-hand furniture and a radiator that clanged through the night. But as John looked around, his expression wasn't judgmental. If anything, he seemed fascinated by the personal touches that made the small space uniquely hers. Family photos, law school textbooks, a laptop covered in coffee stains from late night. Study sessions. This is really you, he said quietly, picking up a picture of her with her mother and brother at her law school graduation. Disappointed? Claudia asked, suddenly self-conscious about the contrast between their living situations. No, John said, setting down the photo and turning to face her. Impressed. You built this life yourself. Everything you have, you earned. The admiration in his voice made her step closer. John, I've been thinking about you constantly, he admitted, his voice rough with want. During meetings, I watch your mouth move when you talk and remember how it felt to kiss you. When you present your analysis, I can barely concentrate, because I keep imagining what it would be like to have you in my bed. His words sent heat pooling low in Claudia's belly. Then why are we still talking? She whispered. John's control snapped. He crossed the small room in 2 strides and pulled her against him, his mouth crashing down on hers with desperate hunger. Claudia responded with equal passion, months of suppressed attraction finally finding release as they lost themselves in each other. Their lovemaking was intense and desperate, fueled by all the tension and longing they'd been denying. John worshipped her body with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, while Claudia showed him what it meant to be truly seen and accepted. When they finally collapsed together in her narrow bed, both were shaking from the intensity of their connection. Christ, Claudia, John breathed against her hair. What are you doing to me? The same thing you're doing to me, she replied, tracing lazy patterns on his chest. They made love twice more that night, each time with growing tenderness, as the desperate edge of their desire softened into something deeper and more precious. But as dawn light began to filter through her thin curtains, reality crept back in. The board meets at 9, John said quietly, his arm tightening around her. I know, Claudia replied, not wanting to break the spell of their night together. Whatever. They decide, this doesn't change, John said fiercely. What we have, it's real and it's worth fighting for. Claudia wanted to believe him, but as she watched him dress for another day of corporate warfare, she couldn't shake the feeling that their night of passion had only made their situation more complicated. They were playing with fire, and sooner or later they were both going to get burned. Chapter 6. Deeper Complications. The board had approved 2 of Claudia's 3 contract restructures. It wasn't a complete victory, but it established precedent. John had emerged from the closed-door session with barely contained triumph, his usual composure cracking just enough to let her see his relief. The small manufacturing firm and software startup would be acquired under terms that protected employees and provided genuine growth opportunities. Only the family logistics business had been rejected, deemed too sentimental by Harrison Webb's faction. It's a start, John had told her that afternoon. Change happens incrementally in corporations. We've proven these structures can work. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, their relationship had shifted into something both more stable and more dangerous. They'd established unspoken rules. No public displays of affection, minimal personal interaction during business hours, absolute discretion about their private time together. But despite their caution, Claudia was increasingly aware that people were starting to notice. Jennifer Walsh, John's assistant, had begun treating Claudia with new deference that felt uncomfortable. David Chen made knowing comments about her, special insight into the CEO's thinking, and Richard Hartman studied her with unconcealed speculation whenever their paths crossed. The whispers were becoming harder to ignore. "Are you sleeping with him?" The blunt question came from Maria Santos, a paralegal at Rodriguez and Associates who'd become a friend. They were having coffee at a diner near Claudia's apartment, far from corporate towers where such conversations could be overheard. "That's a hell of a question," Claudia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's a hell of a situation," Maria shot back. "The word around the legal community is that John Cumming has been making unusual decisions lately. Ethical decisions. And somehow they all trace back to recommendations from a legal aid lawyer." Claudia stared into her coffee cup, unable to meet her friend's eyes. "My work speaks for itself." "I'm sure it does. But work doesn't explain why you've been glowing. Like a woman in love," Maria said gently. "Please tell me you know what you're doing." "I'm helping restructure corporate acquisitions to protect smaller businesses," Claudia replied. "It's good work. And the rest of it?" Claudia was quiet for a long moment. "The rest of it is complicated." That weekend, John surprised her with an invitation to his family's estate in Connecticut. "I thought you might like to see where I grew up." The drive took 2 hours through increasingly affluent neighborhoods until they reached a wrought iron gate opening onto a private road lined with massive oaks. When the house came into view, Claudia suppressed a gasp. It wasn't just large, it was magnificent, a sprawling colonial mansion with perfect proportions and immaculate grounds. "This is where you grew up?" she asked. "Family summers and holidays," John replied, seeming almost embarrassed by the opulence. "During school we lived in the city." The interior was exactly what Claudia expected from old money: antique furniture, oil paintings of stern ancestors, rooms that belonged in museums. But John led her to a more comfortable wing with overstuffed couches and family photographs showing a younger, more carefree version of the man beside her. "You were adorable," Claudia said, studying a picture of 8-year-old John with a gap-toothed grin holding a fishing rod. "I was a terror," John corrected. "I once convinced the groundskeeper to help me dig a moat around the entire east wing." "Did it work?" "Until my mother found out and made me fill it back in," John said with a laugh. They spent the afternoon exploring formal gardens, a pond where John had learned to fish, a tennis court where he'd been forced to take lessons. Claudia tried to imagine growing up in such luxury, but the gap between their childhoods was too vast to bridge. "Tell me about your house," John said as they walked through his mother's rose garden. It was a 3-bedroom unit in a building that housed 12 families, she said finally. "No yard, but there was a playground where kids would gather after school. My bedroom window faced an alley, but if I stood on my bed, I could see a slice of sky between buildings." "Were you happy there?" John asked. "Most of the time," Claudia replied honestly. "We didn't have much money, but we had each other. My mother worked constantly, but she always made time for Marcus and me. She sounds like an amazing woman." "She is," Claudia said softly. "Everything I am, I owe to her." That evening, John cooked dinner in the estate's kitchen, a smaller, more intimate version of the meal he'd prepared at his penthouse. Away from the city and pressures of their professional lives, they could simply be themselves. "I've been thinking about what you said that night," John said as they sat on the terrace with wine, watching sunset over his family's grounds. "About wanting a real home." "What about it?" "This place has been in my family for 70 years, but it's never felt like home to me," John admitted. "It's beautiful but cold, formal. I've always felt like a guest here." "Where does feel like home?" Claudia asked. John turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "Lately, wherever you are?" The simple words hit her like a physical blow. "John, I know it's too soon to say things like that," he continued quickly, "but I need you to know that what I feel for you, it's not just attraction or curiosity about Someone from a different world. It's more than that. Instead of responding with words, Claudia set down her wineglass and moved to straddle his lap, kissing him with all the emotion she couldn't express. Their lovemaking that night was different. From previous encounters, slower, more tender, with an intimacy that went beyond physical. They explored each other with reverent touches, as if trying to memorize every sensation. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in John's childhood bedroom, Claudia felt a peace she'd never experienced. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included this, not just passion and attraction, but deep contentment of being truly known and accepted. "I love you," she whispered against his chest, the words slipping out before she could stop them. John's arms tightened around her. "I love you too," he said quietly. "More than I knew was possible." They spent Sunday morning in bed, making love lazily and talking about everything and nothing. John showed her photo albums from his childhood, while Claudia shared stories about her family that made him laugh until tears streamed down his face. It was while John was in the shower that afternoon that Claudia discovered the documents that would change everything. She'd been looking for something to read and wandered into his father's old study. The room was clearly a shrine to the family patriarch, diplomas covering walls, a massive desk, bookshelves filled with business journals. Claudia was browsing books when she noticed a thick folder that had fallen behind one of the shelf units. Curious, she pulled it out and opened it, expecting family memorabilia. Instead, she found board meeting minutes from 5 years earlier. The documents detailed a systematic strategy for identifying vulnerable minority-owned businesses in emerging markets and structuring acquisition offers that would be difficult to refuse but advantageous for consolidation. The language was clinical, but the intent was clear. Cumming Enterprises had deliberately targeted businesses owned by people of color, women, and immigrants. Claudia's hands trembled as she read page after page of strategic planning that treated human beings like chess pieces. The folder contained detailed profiles of target companies, analysis of their financial vulnerabilities, and recommended approaches for leveraging cultural and economic disadvantages. One name made her blood run cold: Rodriguez Electronics, a small business owned by her uncle Carlos that had been forced to sell to a competitor 5 years ago after supplier contracts mysteriously went bad. According to these documents, Cumming Enterprises had orchestrated those failures by pressuring suppliers to breach contracts with Rodriguez Electronics, then acquiring the company's assets at a fraction of their value. Her uncle had lost everything: his business, his life savings, his faith in the American dream. He'd moved back to Puerto Rico, broken and bitter, never knowing that his failure had been orchestrated by the company where his niece now worked. "Claudia, what are you—" John's voice cut off as he appeared in the doorway and saw what she was holding. The color drained from his face. "Where did you find those?" "Behind the bookshelf," Claudia said numbly. "Is this real? Did your company really do this?" John was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. "Those are old documents, from before I made changes to our acquisition strategy. Before you made changes." Claudia's voice rose. "John, this folder is from 5 years ago. You've been CEO for 8 years. This happened on your watch." "It happened according to policies my father established," John said defensively. "I inherited a company culture that I've been trying to change." "Rodriguez Electronics," Claudia said, her voice shaking. "A Carlos Rodriguez. That was my Uncle John. Your company destroyed my uncle's life." The words hung between them like a physical blow. John's face went white. "Claudia, I didn't know." "You didn't know?" She stood up, the folder clutched in her trembling hands. "You didn't know that your company was systematically targeting minority-owned businesses? You didn't know that while you were sitting in board meetings approving these strategies, real families were losing everything. I inherited those policies, John repeated desperately. When I took over the company, there were dozens of ongoing acquisition projects. I couldn't review every detail. But you could have stopped them, Claudia said, feeling betrayed and naive and utterly foolish. At any point in the last 8 years, you could have said this was wrong and stopped it. I have stopped it, John insisted. The contracts you restructured, the ethical guidelines we're implementing, that's me trying to fix these problems. After how much damage? Claudia asked. How many families destroyed? How many dreams crushed so your shareholders could see better returns? John took a step toward her, his hands outstretched pleadingly. Claudia, please. You have to understand. I understand perfectly, she said, backing away from him. I understand that I've been sleeping with the man who destroyed my uncle's life. I understand that while I was falling in love with you, you were representing everything I've spent my career fighting against. That's not fair, John said desperately. You know me. You know I'm not that person anymore. Do I? Claudia laughed bitterly. 3 months ago, you were perfectly willing to destroy Hartwell Manufacturing with the same predatory tactics outlined in these documents. The only reason you changed your mind was because I called you out on it. Yes, and I listened to you. John said, I changed because of you. Doesn't that mean anything? It means you're capable of change when it's convenient, Claudia replied, but it doesn't erase the damage you've already done. She moved toward the door, but John stepped into her path. Don't do this, Claudia, he said urgently. Don't let these old documents destroy what we have. We love each other. Love? Claudia stared at him in disbelief. You think love excuses this? You think because I fell for your charm, I should just ignore the fact that you've spent 8 years doing exactly what those documents outline? I think you should give me the chance to make things right, John said quietly. I think you should trust that the man you fell in love with is real, even if it took time for him to emerge. Claudia looked at him, really looked at him, trying to reconcile the man who'd made love to her so tenderly with the executive who'd approved strategies for destroying businesses like her uncle's. The worst part was that she could see genuine remorse in his eyes, real pain at having hurt her, but remorse didn't bring back her uncle's business. Love didn't resurrect dreams that had been systematically crushed. I need to go, she said quietly. Claudia, please. I need time to think, she said more firmly. I need to process this without you trying to convince me it doesn't matter. John stepped aside, his shoulders sagging in defeat. Will you at least let me drive you back to the city? I'll take the train, Claudia replied. I need the space. As she walked out of the study, then out of the house, then down the long driveway, toward the gate, Claudia felt like she was leaving more than just John's family estate. She was leaving behind the fantasy that love could bridge the gap between their worlds, that good intentions could erase fundamental differences in their values. The train ride back to the city was the longest 3 hours of her life. Chapter 7. Trust broken. Claudia didn't go to work on Monday. For the first time since starting her contract with Cumming Enterprises, she called in sick and spent the day in her cramped apartment, staring at the documents she'd taken from John's father's study. She'd photocopied them at a 24-hour print, shopped during her long walk from the train station, needing proof that the nightmare was real. Rodriguez Electronics, Hartman Manufacturing Solutions, Delacroix Imports. Page after page of businesses owned by people who looked like her, people who'd been systematically targeted because their skin color or accent or limited resources made them vulnerable. The clinical precision of the strategy made her stomach turn. These weren't random acquisitions, but calculated attacks on communities that had few resources to fight back. Her phone had been ringing all morning. John, probably wondering where she was, why she wasn't returning his calls from the night before. She'd turned it off after the 5th missed call, unable to bear hearing his voice when she was still trying to process the depth of his betrayal. Tuesday morning brought a knock at her door. Claudia opened it to find David Chen standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable. "May I come in?" he asked politely. Claudia stepped aside, suddenly conscious of her apartment's shabbiness. David had never been to her home before, and she could see him taking in the cracked plaster, the mismatched furniture, the general air of someone making do with very little. "Mr. Cumming is concerned about you," David said without preamble. "He asked me to check if you were all right." "I'm fine," Claudia replied, though she suspected she looked anything but fine. She hadn't slept in 2 days, and her emotional exhaustion probably showed on her face. "Are you planning to return to work this week?" Claudia looked at him for a long moment. "That depends on whether Cumming Enterprises wants to continue employing someone who asks uncomfortable questions about company practices." David's eyebrows rose. "Has something happened that I should know about?" "That's between me and Mr. Cumming," Claudia said carefully. "I see." David was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, your work here has been exceptional. The board was very impressed with your acquisition restructures. There's talk of offering you a permanent position with significant advancement opportunities." The irony was devastating. Just when her professional dreams were within reach, she'd discovered that the company was built on everything she'd spent her career fighting against. "I appreciate that," she said quietly, "but I need some time to think about whether this is the right fit." David nodded slowly. "Take the time you need, but don't let personal feelings derail a promising career. In corporate law, you have to separate business from emotion." After he left, Claudia sat in her tiny living room and wondered if that was the problem, that she'd never learned to separate business from emotion. Maybe in John's world, systematically destroying minority-owned businesses was just smart strategy, no different from choosing cost-effective suppliers or negotiating favorable lease terms. But she couldn't see it that way. Every document in that folder represented real people whose lives had been upended for corporate profit. Her uncle Carlos, who'd worked 16-hour days trying to keep his electronics store afloat. The Hartman family, whose third-generation manufacturing company had been absorbed and stripped for parts. Dozens of other entrepreneurs whose dreams had been calculated casualties in Cumming Enterprises' expansion strategy. Wednesday evening brought John to her door. Claudia had anticipated this confrontation, dreading and expecting it in equal measure. When she opened the door, she was struck by how exhausted he looked, still impeccably dressed despite the late hour, but his face drawn with worry and sleepless nights. "We need to talk," he said simply. "I don't think there's anything left to say," Claudia replied, but stepped aside to let him enter. John entered her apartment and immediately dominated the small space with his presence. He looked around with the same careful attention David had shown, but without the judgment. If anything, he seemed to be trying to memorize details, the law school textbooks stacked on her coffee table, the family photos on her kitchen counter, the single dying plant she'd been trying unsuccessfully to keep alive. "You've been avoiding my calls," he said finally. "I needed time to think." "And what have you concluded?" Claudia faced him across her tiny living room, drawing strength from the familiar surroundings. "I've concluded that I was naive to think you were different from every other corporate executive who sees people as assets to be leveraged." John flinched as if she'd slapped him. "That's not fair, and you know it, is it not?" Claudia pulled the folder from her coffee table, holding it between them like evidence in a trial. "Because these documents suggest otherwise." "Those documents are 5 years old," John said desperately. "I've completely changed the company's approach after I forced you to," Claudia interrupted. "If I hadn't confronted you about the Hartwell deal, would you have suddenly developed a conscience? Or would you have continued following the same playbook that destroyed my uncle's business. John was quiet for a long moment, running his hands through his hair. I don't know, he admitted finally. Maybe you're right. Maybe it took your challenge to show me what I'd become. The honesty in his voice almost broke her resolve. Almost. That's the problem, John, she said softly. I fell in love with the man you became when I was watching. But how do I trust that version of you when the real you spent 8 years implementing strategies designed to hurt people like my family? The real me is the man who loves you, John said urgently. The man who wants to build something better, something we can both be proud of. No, Claudia shook her head. The real you is the man who inherited a profitable company and maintained its profitability by any means necessary. The version I fell in love with is just you adapting your strategy to include me. Christ, Claudia, John exploded. Do you really think I'm that calculating, that everything between us has been some elaborate manipulation? I think you're a brilliant businessman who's very good at getting what he wants, Claudia replied. And I think you wanted me enough to become the kind of man I could respect. And what's wrong with that? John demanded. What's wrong with changing for someone you love? Because change that depends on external pressure isn't real change, Claudia said. It's performance, and performances end when the audience leaves. They stared at each other across the small room, the gulf between them feeling wider than ever. Despite the physical proximity, John looked defeated, older than his 32 years. So that's it? He asked quietly. You're going to throw away everything we have because of mistakes I made before I met you? I'm going to protect myself from making an even bigger mistake, Claudia corrected. I'm going to stop pretending that love can bridge the fundamental differences in who we are and what we value. I value you, John said desperately. I value what you've taught me, what you've made me want to become. But you don't value the communities you've hurt, Claudia pointed out. You regret that I found out about it, but do you actually regret doing it? John opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The pause was telling. That's what I thought, Claudia said sadly. It's complicated. No, it's not, Claudia interrupted. Either you think what your company did was wrong, or you think it was justifiable business strategy. There's no middle ground. John sat down heavily on her second-hand couch, his head in his hands. You're asking me to condemn 8 years of decisions made under pressure from my board, with incomplete information, while trying to honor my father's legacy and protect thousands of jobs. I'm asking you to take responsibility for the choices you made, Claudia said. I'm asking you to acknowledge that those strategies were wrong, not just inconvenient now that they've been exposed. And if I stand here and say that every acquisition my company has made in the last 8 years was morally wrong, what then? Does that fix anything? Does it bring back your uncle's business? No, Claudia admitted, but it would be a start toward becoming the man you claim you want to be. John looked up at her, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't know how to be that man, Claudia. I've spent my entire adult life in a world where sentiment is weakness and profit is the only measure of success. You're asking me to completely reinvent myself. I'm not asking you to do anything, Claudia said gently. That's the point. If you want to change, it has to come from you, not from fear of losing me. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their impossible situation settling around them like a shroud. I love you, John said finally. Whatever else you think about me, whatever you believe about my motivations, that's real. I know, Claudia replied, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed. I love you too. That's what makes this so hard. Then don't do this, John pleaded. Don't let my past mistakes destroy our future. Our future was always impossible, Claudia said. I just let myself forget that for a while. John stood slowly, straightening his suit jacket with hands that trembled slightly. What about work? Your contract? I'll finish reviewing the vendor agreements I've already started, Claudia said. But after that, I think it's best if Rodriguez and Associates finds a different consultant for your company. The board won't understand. They'll assume you left. Because the work was too challenging. Let them assume whatever they want, Claudia replied. It doesn't matter anymore. John moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to her. For what it's worth, you're wrong about one thing. What's that? You didn't make me want to become a better man, John said quietly. You made me realize that I already was one, buried under 8 years of compromises and rationalizations. You didn't change me, Claudia. You just helped me remember who I used to be. After he left, Claudia finally allowed herself to cry, great, heaving sobs that shook her small frame and left her gasping for breath. She cried for her Uncle Carlos and all the other entrepreneurs whose dreams had been systematically crushed. She cried for the man she'd fallen in love with, who might have been real but was certainly lost. And she cried for herself, for the future she'd allowed herself to imagine and the heart she'd given to someone who could never truly be hers. The next morning, she called Rodriguez and Associates and requested a transfer to a different client. The weeks that followed were the longest of Claudia's life. She threw herself into pro bono work, helping small business owners review contracts and protect themselves from predatory terms. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now doing exactly what she'd accused John of failing to do, using her expertise to prevent the kind of exploitation his company had pioneered. But the work felt hollow, without the intellectual challenge and financial security of the coming contract. Worse, everything reminded her of John. Corporate law journals made her think of their late-night strategy sessions. Acquisition news triggered memories of their passionate debates. Even her morning coffee tasted flat because it wasn't accompanied by the anticipation of seeing him. Her friends and family tried to be supportive, but they didn't understand the complexity of her situation. Her mother thought she was crazy for walking away from such a prestigious opportunity. Marcus, now a senior in high school with college applications pending, couldn't hide his disappointment about the lost income that would have helped pay for his education. You did the right thing, Mija, her mother said during one of their evening phone calls. But sometimes doing the right thing is a luxury poor people can't afford. It was a conversation that haunted Claudia, forcing her to confront the privilege inherent in her moral stance. She could afford to walk away from John because she'd always lived with very little. But what about the single mothers working in Cumming Enterprises call centers? What about the janitors and security guards whose jobs depended on the company's continued profitability? Was her ethical purity worth more than their economic security? 2 months after their confrontation, Claudia was working late at Rodriguez and Associates when David Chen appeared in the office lobby. She was surprised to see him. They'd had no contact since that awkward visit to her apartment. I was hoping we could talk, he said politely. Claudia led him to a small conference room, noting how shabby the legal aid office must look compared to the luxury of Cumming Enterprises. How are you? David asked, and seemed genuinely interested. In the answer, I'm fine, Claudia replied automatically. Are you? Because frankly, you look terrible. The blunt assessment made her smile for the first time in weeks. That's what happens when you work 80-hour weeks for non-profit wages. Is that why you left? The money? You know why I left, Claudia said carefully. David nodded slowly. I suspected it had something to do with your relationship with John. Claudia's eyes widened. You knew? I'm not blind, David said with a slight smile, and neither is the rest of the legal department. The question is whether you left because the relationship ended, or whether the relationship ended because you left. Does it matter? It matters because John Cumming is destroying himself, trying to become the kind of CEO you could respect, David said quietly. And it matters because the company is suffering while he pursues ethical policies that make no financial sense. Claudia's heart clenched. What do you mean? He's rejected 6 profitable acquisitions in the last 2 months because they didn't meet what he calls Claudia's standards, David explained. He's implementing employee protection policies that have cost us millions. The board is starting to question his judgment. That's not my fault, Claudia said defensively. Isn't it? David challenged. You challenged him to become a better man, then abandoned him when he tried to change. What did you expect would happen? I expected him to change because he wanted to, not because he was trying to win me back, Claudia replied. And how exactly are you supposed to tell the difference? David asked. How do you measure someone's motivations when they're doing exactly what you said you wanted them to do? The question haunted Claudia long after David left. That night, alone in her apartment, she found herself wondering if she'd been too harsh, too unforgiving. Maybe John's motivations didn't matter as much as his actions. Maybe the communities that would benefit from his reformed policies cared more about results than about the purity of his intentions. Or maybe she was just looking for an excuse to forgive him because living without him was slowly killing her. 2 weeks later, she got her answer when the local business journal ran a front-page story about Cumming Enterprises' new Community Partnership Initiative, a comprehensive program that provided legal aid, business development support, and preferential contract terms to minority-owned businesses. The program was being funded entirely by the company, with no expectation of return on investment. At the bottom of the article was a quote from John that made her hands shake as she read it. We have a responsibility to repair the damage our industry has done to vulnerable communities. This initiative is our attempt to do business in a way that builds up rather than tears down. It was exactly what she'd wanted him to say, exactly the kind of program she'd dreamed of creating herself. The only question was whether it was real or whether it was just an elaborate attempt to win her back. But as Claudia read the details of the initiative, the substantial funding, the comprehensive scope, the genuine partnerships with community organizations, she realized that it didn't matter. Whatever John's motivations, real families would benefit from these programs. Real businesses would be protected from the kind of predatory practices that had destroyed her uncle's dream. Maybe love wasn't about perfect motivations or pure intentions. Maybe it was about finding someone who made you want to be better, even if the wanting was complicated and messy and imperfect. Maybe it was time to find out if the man she'd fallen in love with was still there, buried under months of hurt and pride and fear. Maybe it was time to go home. Chapter 8. Proving Change. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. Mija, I'm at the hospital. Her mother's voice was weak but trying to sound strong. It's my heart. The doctors say I need surgery. Claudia was out of bed and searching for clothes before her mother finished speaking. I'm coming. Which hospital? Mount Sinai. I was having chest pains, and Mrs. Rodriguez made me call an ambulance. Elena Mia's voice wavered. The doctors say it's serious, Claudia. The surgery, it's expensive. Don't worry about the money, Mama, Claudia said, though. Her mind was already calculating costs. I'll figure something out. The next 18 hours were a blur of medical consultations and growing panic. Elena needed a triple bypass within the week, but insurance required pre-authorizations that could take months. The cardiac surgeon was blunt. Find a way to cover the costs or risk waiting until Elena's condition deteriorated enough to qualify for emergency intervention. We're looking at approximately $300,000, the financial counselor explained. Your mother's insurance will cover about 60% after deductibles. The remaining balance would need to be paid up front. Claudia stared at the paperwork, the numbers swimming before her exhausted eyes. She could maybe scrape together $20,000 if she liquidated everything she owned. It wasn't even close to enough. How long do we have to arrange financing? The surgery is scheduled for Friday morning, the counselor replied. We'll need guarantee of payment by Thursday evening. 3 days. Claudia had 3 days to find $120,000 or watch her mother's health deteriorate. She spent Wednesday making increasingly desperate phone calls. Every bank turned her down for a loan that, large. Her law school friends were sympathetic but in no position to help. Rodriguez and Associates offered her an advance on future earnings, but it barely made a dent in what she needed. By Wednesday evening, Claudia was sitting in the hospital waiting room, staring at her phone and contemplating the one call she'd been avoiding. John would help, she knew that with absolute certainty. He'd probably write a check without blinking, but accepting his money would prove everything she'd accused him of, that she was just another charity case for his guilty conscience. Claudia? She looked up to find David Chen standing beside her chair, looking uncomfortable but determined. David, what are you doing here? I heard about your mother, he said, sitting down beside her. I wanted to talk to you about something. Claudia felt heat rise in her cheeks. If John sent you, he didn't, David interrupted. He doesn't know I'm here. In fact, he'd probably fire me if he found out. Then why are you here? David pulled out a tablet and showed her a document. I'm here because Cumming Enterprises just implemented a new employee benefits package. Expanded health coverage for all contract workers and their immediate families, retroactive to the beginning of their employment. Claudia stared at the screen, not quite comprehending. I don't understand. Your contract with our company makes you eligible for our health benefits, David explained. Under the new policy, your mother's surgery would be fully covered, but I'm not working for you anymore, Claudia protested. I terminated my contract 2 months ago. Actually, you didn't, David said gently. You requested a temporary leave of absence while you sorted out personal issues. Your contract doesn't officially end until June. Claudia looked at him suspiciously. That's not how I remember it. That's how the paperwork was filed, David replied. Sometimes administrative errors work in people's favor. David, Claudia said slowly, this is charity. This is exactly the kind of personal intervention that This is company policy, David interrupted firmly. The new benefits package applies to all contract workers. It affects 300 people, not just you. But the timing is coincidental, David said. The board approved these changes last month. The fact that your mother needs surgery now is just fortunate, Claudia wanted to argue, but the relief flooding through her was too overwhelming. Her mother would get the surgery she needed. There's paperwork to complete, David continued, handing her a folder. But once it's processed, everything will be covered. Why are you doing this? Claudia asked quietly. David was quiet for a moment. Because I've worked for corporate law firms for 15 years, and I've never seen a CEO transform his entire company's culture because one person challenged him to be better. Whatever happened between you and John, it changed him. And those changes are helping a lot of people. Elena's surgery was successful. The doctors reported that they'd cleared all blockages and her prognosis was excellent. Claudia spent the next week in the hospital, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs and helping her mother navigate recovery. It was during one of those long nights that John appeared. Claudia was dozing in the chair beside her mother's bed when she heard a soft knock. She opened her eyes to find John standing in the doorway holding flowers and looking uncertain about whether he was welcome. I hope it's okay that I came, he said quietly. David told me about your mother's surgery. Claudia glanced at Elena, who was sleeping peacefully, then gestured for John to follow her into the hallway. You didn't have to come, she said, though she was surprised by how glad she was to see him. He looked thinner than she remembered, with shadows under his eyes. I wanted to, John replied. How is she? The surgery went perfectly. She'll need several weeks of recovery, but the doctors say she should make a full recovery. That's wonderful, John said, and the relief in his voice seemed genuine. I'm glad she's going to be okay. They stood in the hospital corridor, and Claudia felt the familiar tension that always existed between them. But this time it was different, softer, sadder, tinged with months of separation and hurt. Thank you, she said finally, for the insurance coverage. I know the timing wasn't really coincidental. John met her eyes steadily. It wasn't charity, Claudia. The benefits expansion was approved by the board based on employee retention studies. Your mother's coverage was legitimate, but you implemented it knowing it would help her. I implemented it knowing it would help 300 families, John corrected, including yours. Why? Claudia asked. Why change the entire benefits structure? John leaned against the wall, looking tired. Because you were right about something. Companies have a responsibility to the communities they operate in, not just to their shareholders. It's good business that also happens to be good for people. And the Community Partnership Initiative, Claudia asked. Is that good business too? John's eyebrows rose. You know about that? I read the Business Journal article. Some of it is good business, John admitted, but some of it is just necessary. A debt that needed to be paid. To who? To people like your uncle, John said, quietly. To every family whose business we destroyed, while telling ourselves it was just smart strategy. They were quiet for a moment, the weight of everything between them settling in the sterile hospital air. I've been thinking about what you said, John continued, about change having to come from within rather than external pressure. You were right about that too. Was I? I spent 8 years making decisions based on what my board expected, what my shareholders demanded, what my father would have done, John said. I never stopped to ask what I believed was right. It took losing you to realize that external validation is worthless if you can't respect yourself. Claudia studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation. But all she saw was exhaustion and genuine regret. The board isn't happy with your new direction, she said. No, they're not, John agreed. They think I've lost my edge. Harrison Webb called me dangerously sentimental last week. And how do you feel about that? John smiled, a real smile, the first she'd seen from him in months. I feel like I'd rather be sentimental than ruthless. I'd rather build something I'm proud of than something that just makes money, even if it costs you your position. Even then, John said firmly, I can always find another job. I can't find another soul. The words hit her like a physical blow. This was what she'd wanted from him, acknowledgement that his previous actions were wrong, evidence that his change was real rather than performative. John, I'm not telling you this to win you back, he said quickly. I'm telling you because you deserved the truth from the beginning, and I was too proud and scared to give it to you. Scared of what? Scared that if I admitted how lost I was, how much I'd compromised my values for success, you'd see that I wasn't worth saving, John said quietly. Claudia felt tears prick her eyes. You were always worth saving. Was I? Because sometimes I think you were right to leave. Sometimes I think you saw me more clearly than I saw myself. I saw someone who was trapped by expectations and circumstances, Claudia said softly. Someone who had the capacity for better, but didn't know how to access it. And now? Claudia looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the changes that 2 months of separation had wrought. There was something different in his eyes, something that looked like peace. Now I see someone who's figuring out who he wants to be, she said. Someone who's willing to pay the cost of becoming that person. John stepped closer. Claudia, Mrs. Claudia. A voice interrupted them. They turned to see Elena's nurse approaching. Your mother is asking for you." "Of course," Claudia said, stepping away from John reluctantly. "I should go." "Wait," John said urgently. Would you be willing to have dinner with me when your mother is feeling better?" Claudia hesitated. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, but she'd learned to be cautious with her heart. "Let me think about it," she said finally. As Claudia returned to her mother's room, she found Elena awake and alert, watching her with knowing eyes. "That was him, wasn't it?" Elena asked weakly. "The man you've been crying over for 2 months. Mama, you should rest. That man arranged for my surgery to be covered, didn't he?" Claudia sighed. "The company expanded their benefits package. It wasn't personal." "Everything is personal when you love someone," Elena said gently. "And he loves you, Misha. I could see it in his eyes." "It's complicated, Mama. Love is always complicated," Elena replied. "The question is whether it's worth fighting for." That night, as Claudia dozed in the hospital chair, she thought about John's words, about the changes he'd made, about the man he was becoming. She thought about her Uncle Carlos and all the other families who would benefit from coming enterprises. New policies. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about perfect motivations or pure intentions. Maybe it was about recognizing that people could change, that love could inspire transformation, that second chances were sometimes worth the risk. Maybe it was time to find out if the man she'd fallen in love with was still there, stronger now. For having been tested, maybe it was time to go home. Chapter 9. External Threats. 3 weeks after her mother's surgery, Claudia found herself sitting across from John in the same small Italian restaurant where they'd first discussed their impossible situation. But this time, the conversation was different. This time, they were trying to rebuild something that had been broken, rather than navigate something that was just beginning. "I've been thinking about what you said," Claudia began, turning her wine glass nervously between her fingers, "about change having to come from within. And I think maybe I was wrong to demand perfection from you when I couldn't offer it myself," she admitted. "I made mistakes too. I walked away when things got difficult instead of fighting for what we had." John reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You walked away because I gave you reasons not to trust me. That's not your fault." "Isn't it?" Claudia asked. "You were trying to change, trying to become better, and I punished you for not being perfect immediately." "You held me accountable," John corrected. "There's a difference." They'd been having these conversations for weeks now. Careful, honest discussions about what had gone wrong between them and whether it could be fixed. John had been patient with her hesitation, understanding her need to rebuild trust slowly. They'd had coffee twice, lunch once, and now this dinner, each meeting a tentative step toward something that felt increasingly possible. "I love you," John said quietly. "I know I hurt you, and I know trust has to be earned back. But I need you to know that what I feel for you hasn't changed." "I love you too," Claudia replied, the words feeling both familiar and frightening. "But love isn't enough if we can't figure out how to build a life together." "Then let's figure it out," John said simply. "Whatever it takes." Their reconciliation was interrupted by John's phone buzzing urgently. He glanced at it and frowned. "I'm sorry, I need to take this," he said, answering the call. "Harrison, what's wrong?" Claudia watched John's face grow increasingly grim as he listened to whatever Harrison Webb was telling him. Finally, he hung up and looked at her with an expression that made her stomach clench. "What is it?" she asked. "Meridian Industries is making a move," John said tersely. "They've been quietly buying up shares for months. Harrison thinks they're planning a hostile takeover." Claudia knew enough about corporate law to understand the implications. "How much do they control?" "About 30% at last count. They need 51% to force a takeover, but they've been very strategic about hiding their intentions. What does this mean for your reforms?" Claudia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. It means they'll probably use my reckless idealism as justification for removing me, John said bitterly. Meridian's CEO, Thomas Blackwood, has been vocal about companies that prioritize social responsibility over profits. Can you fight it? I can try, John replied, but if they can convince enough shareholders that my new policies are hurting the company's value. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everything John had worked to change, every reform Claudia had inspired, would be undone if Meridian succeeded in their takeover. The attack came 3 days later in a way neither expected. Claudia was at Rodriguez and Associates, reviewing contracts for small business clients, when Maria Santos burst into her office, clutching a tabloid newspaper. "You need to see this," Maria said urgently, spreading the paper across Claudia's desk. The headline made Claudia's stomach drop. "Corporate Romeo's Ghetto Juliet. How a poor girl's radical ideas are destroying a billion-dollar company." The article was devastating in its precision. Someone had leaked details about Claudia and John's relationship, complete with photos of them leaving the restaurant 3 nights earlier. But worse than the invasion of privacy was the narrative being constructed that John Cumming, brilliant CEO, had been manipulated by his working-class lover into making disastrous business decisions. Sources close to the company report that Cumming's recent policy changes can be traced directly to his romantic involvement with Claudia Meir, a legal aid lawyer from East Hartford, whose radical views on corporate responsibility have cost shareholders millions, the article read. Ms. Meir, whose uncle's failed business was acquired by Cumming Enterprises in 2020, appears to have used her personal relationship with the CEO to advance an anti-corporate agenda that threatens the company's future. The personal details were humiliating. Descriptions of her shabby apartment, references to her mother's recent surgery, speculation about whether she was a gold digger using social justice rhetoric to manipulate a wealthy man. But the professional implications were worse. The article painted her as unqualified and vindictive, someone whose only credential was her willingness to sleep with her boss. "How did they get all this information?" Claudia asked, staring at the photos of her apartment. "Building, her mother's hospital. Someone with access fed it to them," Maria said grimly. "Someone who knows both of your schedules, your personal history, your family situation." Claudia's phone started ringing. Reporters wanting comments, colleagues expressing concern, friends checking if she was okay. She turned it off and tried to focus on work, but the humiliation was overwhelming. By evening, the story had been picked up by business journals and local news stations. The narrative was consistent across all coverage. John Cumming's judgment had been compromised by his involvement with an unqualified woman who was using their relationship to pursue a personal vendetta against corporate America. John called that night, his voice tight with fury. "I'm so sorry, Claudia. I have lawyers working on this, trying to find out who leaked the information." "It doesn't matter who leaked it," Claudia said wearily. "What matters is that it's true." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I did influence your decisions," Claudia said. "I did push you to change policies that were profitable. I did have a personal reason for opposing your company's practices." "And those were good changes," John said firmly. "Changes that were long overdue." "But the board doesn't see it that way, does it?" Claudia asked. "They see a CEO whose judgment has been compromised by his romantic involvement with someone who has an agenda." John was quiet for a moment. Harrison called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. They want to discuss leadership stability in light of recent media attention. "They're going to use this against you?" "Probably." Claudia felt sick. "John, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "This is not your fault," John said fiercely. "This is a coordinated attack by people who want to destroy everything we've built together." But Claudia wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, as the media attention intensified, She began to see the situation from the board's perspective. Here was a CEO who drastically altered his company's direction after becoming involved with a woman who had personal reasons to oppose their previous practices. From the outside, it looked like manipulation, even if that wasn't the reality. The harassment escalated quickly. Reporters camped outside her apartment building, ambushing neighbors for quotes about the radical lawyer who'd seduced their way into corporate power. Her mother, still recovering from surgery, was followed to her doctor's appointments by photographers hoping for dramatic shots. Marcus, now a senior in high school, was confronted by journalists asking if his sister was really a corporate infiltrator. "This has to stop," Claudia told John during a tense phone call Friday evening. "My family is being harassed because of our relationship. I have security arranging protection for your family," John replied, "and my legal team is pursuing restraining orders against the most aggressive outlets." "That's not the point," Claudia said. "The point is that our relationship is being used as a weapon against you. As long as we're together, every decision you make will be questioned. Every reform will be attributed to my influence." "Let them question it," John said stubbornly. "I know why I'm making these changes, and it's not because you're manipulating me." "But how will anyone else know that?" Claudia asked. "How will the board, the shareholders, the business community ever trust your judgment again when they think you're being controlled by someone with a personal agenda?" "I don't care what they think." "You have to care," Claudia said desperately. "If you lose control of the company, all the reforms we worked for will be reversed. Meridian will gut the employee benefits, end the community partnership initiative, go back to the predatory acquisition strategies that started this whole mess." John was quiet for a long moment. "Are you asking me to choose between you and the company?" "I'm asking you to consider what's best for the thousands of people whose lives will be affected by this decision," Claudia replied. "I'm asking you to think about whether our happiness is worth more than their jobs, their benefits, their future." "And what about our future?" John asked quietly. Claudia closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "Maybe we don't get to have one. Maybe some things are more important than what we want." The board meeting was brutal. Harrison Webb, Victoria Blackstone, and Richard Hartman had formed a coalition demanding John's resignation, arguing that his compromised judgment made him unfit to lead the company through the Meridian challenge. The reforms he'd implemented were characterized as reckless experiments that had weakened the company's competitive position. "Your personal life has become a liability," Harrison said bluntly during the closed-door session. "Whether or not you're actually being manipulated is irrelevant. The perception exists, and it's damaging our credibility with investors. The reforms have improved employee retention and expanded our market reach," John argued. "They're working exactly as intended." "They're working as your girlfriend intended," Victoria replied coldly, which raises questions about whose interests you're really serving. The vote was close, 7 board members supporting John's continued leadership, 5 calling for his resignation. It was enough to keep his position for now, but barely. And everyone knew that if Meridian succeeded in acquiring more shares, the balance would shift. That night, John came to Claudia's apartment looking defeated. The harassment had finally forced her to stop answering her door to strangers, but she recognized his voice through the intercom. "I saved my job," he said without preamble when she let him in. "Barely." "Congratulations," Claudia replied. Though the word felt hollow, Victoria made it clear that any further incidents would result in a no-confidence vote. John continued. "Essentially, they're tolerating our relationship as long as it doesn't generate any more negative publicity. And if it does." John met her eyes, and she could see the exhaustion there, the weight of trying to balance his love for her with his responsibility to the company. "Then I'll have to make a choice." They both knew what that choice would be. John could find another, job could start over somewhere else. But the reforms they'd worked to implement, the policies that protected vulnerable employees and communities, those would disappear if he lost control of Coming Enterprises. "I've been thinking about taking a position with a non-profit," Claudia said quietly. "There's an organization that provides legal aid to small businesses nationwide. They've offered me a role that would involve traveling, helping entrepreneurs protect themselves from predatory contracts." "That sounds like important work," John said carefully. "It would mean leaving the city," Claudia continued. "At least for a while, maybe permanently. Is that what you want?" Claudia looked around her tiny apartment, at the photos of her family, at the life she'd built despite all the obstacles. "I want you to be free to run your company without worrying about how our relationship affects your decisions. I want the reforms to survive and grow. I want my family to be safe from harassment. And personally, what do you want for yourself?" "I want a love that doesn't require choosing between personal happiness and doing what's right," Claudia said, softly. "I want a relationship that makes both of us stronger instead of forcing impossible choices." John moved closer, cupping her face gently in his hands. "What if I told you I have a plan? What if I told you there might be a way to fight Meridian and protect what we've built?" "What kind of plan?" "The kind that requires trusting me one more time," John said. "The kind that might cost me everything, but could save the company and give us a real future together." Claudia searched his eyes, seeing determination mixed with love and a hint of the strategic thinking that had made him successful. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to trust that sometimes the best way to fight is to let your enemies think they're winning," John said cryptically. "And I need you to be ready to help me when the time comes." "John, if this plan involves sacrificing yourself, it involves sacrificing some things to save others," he corrected. "But not us, never us, not if I can help it." As Claudia looked into his eyes, she realized that despite everything they'd been through, the betrayals, the separations, the impossible choices, she still trusted him. She trusted his intelligence, his integrity, and his love for her. "Tell me what you need," she said simply. John's smile was brilliant with relief and determination. "I need you to help me save our company and our future. Are you with me?" "Always," Claudia replied, and meant it completely. Chapter 10. Building Something New. The plan was audacious and completely dependent on precise timing. For 2 weeks, Claudia worked in secret, using her legal expertise to structure what John called the most important deal of my life. A deal. While media speculated about their relationship and Meridian Industries circled like vultures, she and John were building something that would change everything. "The key is the employee stock ownership program," Claudia explained during one of their midnight meetings in John's office. "If we transfer 30% of company shares to employees, it creates a voting bloc aligned with your reforms and makes a hostile takeover nearly impossible," John added, studying her legal documents. "Meridian would need to convince employees to vote against their own interests." The breakthrough came when Claudia realized they could tie the program to existing profit sharing. "We're expanding something that already exists," she told John excitedly. "Much harder to challenge." "You're brilliant," John said, pulling her into his arms. "Absolutely brilliant." Their kiss was hungry and desperate, fueled by weeks working toward a common goal. Meridian forced their hand Thursday night. Thomas Blackwood announced his company had acquired 43% of Coming Enterprises stock and would call for John's removal. "Coming Enterprises has lost its way under current management," Blackwood declared. "It's time for leadership that prioritizes profit over political correctness." "He's moving faster than expected," Claudia said, as John paced. "Then we move faster," John replied, calling an emergency board meeting. The board meeting was unlike anything Claudia had witnessed. John presented their restructuring plan with fierce determination. Employee ownership, expanded benefits, community partnerships presented as strategic advantages. "We're not sacrificing profit for principles," John argued. "We're proving they can coexist." The vote was 9-3 in favor. When employees learned they would become partial owners with permanently protected benefits, the response was overwhelming. The vote wasn't close. 87% approved. Combined with John's shares, it gave them 54% control, enough to block any takeover. Meridian's lawsuit challenging the program failed. The restructuring was implemented, and 6 months later, Cumming Enterprises reported record profits and employee satisfaction. "I told you ethical business could be profitable," Claudia said, as they reviewed quarterly reports in John's office. "You were wrong about one thing, though," John said, reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a velvet box. "You said we could never bridge the gap between our worlds." Claudia's breath caught as John dropped to one knee, revealing a stunning engagement ring. "Claudia Meir," John said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've made me a better man and shown me that love isn't about choosing between happiness and doing right. It's about finding someone who inspires you to do right. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Claudia whispered, tears streaming. "Yes, of course, yes." As John slipped the ring on her finger, Claudia felt complete. "There's something else," John said. "I've been working on creating Director of Community Legal Services, running a foundation that provides legal aid to small businesses. I want us to run it together." "That's everything I've ever dreamed of," Claudia said softly. Their wedding 8 months later perfectly reflected the bridge they'd built between worlds. The ceremony was held in the community center, where Claudia's mother had attended ESL classes, decorated with flowers from John's estate. Elena walked her daughter down the aisle in a dress John had quietly arranged. Marcus served as John's groomsman, having been accepted to Harvard with a company scholarship. The guest list mixed corporate executives and legal aid workers, socialites and immigrant families, board members and warehouse employees. "When I first met Claudia," John said during his speech, "she challenged me to see my company and myself differently. Today, we're building a company that serves its community, employees who have voice in their future, and a foundation that helps entrepreneurs achieve dreams. Most importantly, we're building a love that makes us both stronger." Claudia's response was heartfelt. "John taught me that change is possible, that love can inspire transformation. Together, we're proving that business and ethics, profit and principles, love and justice can coexist." As they danced their first dance, Claudia looked around at the celebration. Her mother laughing with John's associates, Marcus discussing policy with Victoria Blackstone, David Chen teaching Elena's neighbor to waltz. "Any regrets?" John asked as they swayed together. "Just one," Claudia replied. "I wish we could have figured this out sooner." "We needed the fighting," John said seriously. "We needed to test whether what we felt could survive hard times. And it did." "It is," Claudia corrected, kissing him. "It is." 2 years after that first confrontation, when a poor girl from East Hartford had declared his contract was a trap, Claudia and John had built something neither could have imagined. A love that bridged worlds, a company that served its community, and a future proving sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with "excuse me," but their love had conquered all, transforming everything it touched. And that, Claudia thought as she danced with her husband, was the most beautiful trap of all.